Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Big Topics, Short Takes. This is a new series that is being brought to you by Columbia College Alumni Association. My name is Kurt Roloffs. I'm the college class of '88. I'm the co-chair of the Intellectual Programming Committee that has developed this new program. I will be introducing our esteemed speaker, Professor Jones, Ty Jones, today, and then coming back at the end of his talk, which will be 30-40 minutes, at which point I'll pose to him questions that some of you have previously submitted, or ones that any of you who wish to ask questions during his talk will submit, and we will figure out how to collate those. My co-chair, Joanne Kwan, will help Thandi and I coordinate that and put the questions to Professor Jones. The idea of Big Topics, Short Takes is that we take a topic of strong current interest to the alumni, or ones of perennial interest to the alumni, and allow and find several different professors and different faculty at Columbia to speak to the topic from their expertise and their scholarship and their experience at Columbia. And then at the latter end of the hour, for all of you to engage in one way or another. We will be, with this new series, we're trying a couple of different formats. Today's format is where the questions will come at the very end. Later in the series, we're going to try a format where there actually is small group discussion that happens, and we'll be doing that with Professor Neer in late October, early November. Let me introduce right now Professor Jones, and he is the Herbert H. Lehman Curator for American History and the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia. He graduated from the Journalism School in 2002, and his additional graduate degrees in 2008, 2009, and 2012. He teaches the history of radicalism and social movements at Columbia University. He is the author of several books, including More Powerful Than Dynamite, Radicals, Plutocrats, and Progressives, and New York's Year of Anarchy, A Radical Line from the Labor Movement to the Weather Ground, and One Family's Century of Conscience, which is about his own family, as a matter of fact, and his mother in particular. He has served as a historical consultant and co-writer on the award-winning podcast Mother Country Radicals, and his writing has appeared in a variety of national publications, including The New Yorker, The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Nation, and Occupied Wall Street Journal. And at this point, I'm going to allow Professor Jones' camera to come on, and for him to present his prepared remarks in conjunction with some slides that he's developed for us. Professor Jones?
Great. Thank you so much, Kurt, and thank you to Joanne and Thandi for helping get this all organized. So there are many points in time when I could have started this story, but for me, it made sense to just dive right in. And the logical place to begin is the spring of 24, when Columbia experienced some of the most shocking acts of student civil disobedience in the institution's history. But I'm talking about the spring of 1924, when in April of that year, after midnight, a group of men in the white robes of the Ku Klux Klan doused a 7-foot-tall wooden cross in gasoline and lit it on fire out front of Fernald Hall. So here's a picture of what the South Lawn would have looked like at that time. This was an act of civil disobedience. This was really an act of terror, and it was aimed to preserve white supremacy on campus. Its immediate target was a Black law student named Frederick Wells, who had recently moved into the dorm at Fernald Hall. And the cross burning was part of a campaign of harassment and terror that Wells would endure for the whole rest of that year. Refusing to leave, he was supported by the NAACP, and his case became an international controversy. He courageously remained in the law school until the end of the term and then transferred out of Columbia. So the attack on Wells, which was in 1924, came in the context of the Great Migration, when Columbia, which had moved twice before, now moved up to Morningside Heights in an effort to really insulate itself from the diverse population of New York City. And instead, after a few short years, found itself neighbors to the community of Harlem, which from about 1914 on increasingly became dominated by a Black majority and eventually became the most famous Black neighborhood in the world. And this is a memo I've found in the archives. This is a secret memo to President Nicholas Murray Butler in 1926. You can see even then, just a few years into the Great Migration, they were already mapping Black residents. They were planning. In this text to the right, you can see it may be worth our while to consider whether the possibility of still further spread is an increasing reason why we should control all the property opposite the university holdings on 116th Street and Amsterdam Avenue. Columbia's leaders never traced the perpetrators of the cross burning, and in fact, they never even tried. Instead, they just denied that students had been involved, although it seems obvious that they were students, and no one was ever punished. In fact, the main outcome of the cross burning episode was not punishment of the perpetrators, but success for the terror committers. Hoping to avoid future controversy, Columbia instituted de facto segregation in the college and in the residence hall. So for the first time in the years after the cross burning, people who were applying for admission to Columbia had to include a photograph, as you can see here on this admissions form, a photograph showing your full face. So instead of officially barring Black people and people of color, they asked you to provide a photograph, which would allow the administration to tell what people's race were and to maintain racial purity on campus. So why am I starting here? In one sense, this is a successful instance of a radical act of civil disobedience. And these white supremacist students use terror to achieve their goal. And in the 100 years since this event, a significant amount of extra-legal civil disobedience at Columbia has been perpetrated by administrators and their proxy who were seeking to reinforce the social order, maintain elite hierarchies and racial segregation. And although student leaders and protesters on the left have received most of the notoriety, this fact, I think, should be recalled that those students have been reacting time and again against an established defense of privilege and have braved very serious repercussions, including violence for their actions. So before diving into the main story here, I just want to highlight a couple of themes that we'll follow through. One, we'll see time and again that the campus space itself becomes an arena for contentious politics, whether it's through encampments, barricades, the construction of structures on campus, or occupation of buildings. We'll see a tension that just never goes away between local campus issues about governance, about free speech, about student rights, and global conflicts in the Middle East, in Vietnam, and student activists always trying to find the best way to manage local questions and these sort of global issues that they're being activists about. The relationship to Harlem is crucial, always in the history of activism at Columbia. We'll hear students and people opposed to their protests talking about tactics. Is it too extreme? Is it justified? Does it go too far? Activists and their opponents are always vying for community support, and this question of tactical choices is always key to that. The key thing is we're going to talk about what it means that Columbia has a radical tradition and why it matters. There's very few institutions in this country that have such an impactful tradition of activism, and the history of the past century really shows how it works. And finally, perhaps for the Q&A, we'll think about measuring outcomes and success. What would it mean to call a radical political action a success. So before the 1960s, Columbia students were known far and wide as very dependable pillars of ruling class privilege. At the start of the 20th century, it was not uncommon for Columbia students to volunteer as strikebreakers or to otherwise actively repress working people, immigrants, women, and people of color. In a very famous instance, in a 1905 subway strike, Columbia undergraduates actually stepped in to act as scabs by operating the trains during a work stoppage. And you can see this newspaper saying that Columbia students seized the opportunity to, my thing's covered, enjoy the excitement of strike breaking. And the transit companies actually did let Columbia students operate the trains, and the results were somewhat predictable. It was a massive subway accident that was being operated by strike-breaking operators, and 29 people were hurt. This is actually not a picture of that accident, which I couldn't find. I don't think it was quite this dramatic, but the Columbia students did, in fact, crash a train while strike-breaking. In those years, they were much more known for organizing in favor of Jim Crow, perpetuating nostalgic ideas about the Confederacy and the histories of enslavement. Annual student pageants involve blackface. In this case, students dressing up as their conception of Zulus, but also wearing yellowface in parodies and stereotypes of Asian people. And just actively supporting Jim Crow over and over again. Here in 1923 is an act of civil disobedience when the Columbia chapter of the KKK interrupted a commencement. So again, a disruption of Columbia commencement, in this case, once again, no repercussions, no investigation. There's a toleration of student disruptions that are in the service of these types of elite social orders and reactionary views on race. In the 1930s, there are many Columbia students who are involved in left-wing organizations in support of the Spanish Republicans during the Civil War, who organized in major student organizations. But at Columbia, it was just as notable that they're founding an organization called the Blue Shirts, which was intended to disrupt radical protests, and this had the support of the president. And scholars have shown that Columbia administrators in the 1930s were passing along secret information about their own students to the FBI. In this case, claiming, really without any evidence, that the communists were in control of campus chapters of important American student activist organizations. So again and again, we're seeing how administrative preferences were supporting anti-radical efforts and also really offering severe repercussions for anyone who was trying to launch a protest movement. Let me just shout out here Tommy Song, who may or may not be in this webinar now. Tommy is an alum and a historian who wrote a terrific piece in the spring for The Nation called Columbia's Violence Against Protesters Has a Long History. So a lot of what I'm talking about today is drawn from Tommy's work, and this is a great read for anyone who's interested. So this is about where things stood in the 1960s. As late as 1967, Columbia remained an unpromising and unlikely site for a radical protest that would literally change the world. Here are some headlines from 1967. CU phenomenon, quiet. SDS ineffectual. Rifts within student left hamper anti-war efforts. But in the next year, Columbia's public reputation would transform permanently. Previously known as a site of white supremacy and anti-radicalism, anti-Semitism, strike-breaking, and class privilege, the university would become known, at least in its own promotional literature, as the activist Ivy. And really, the university's radical protest tradition effectively originated in 1968. So a number of different causes, again, you see local issues and global issues contributed to the growth of campus politics and protest at this time. And these flyers show how interconnected these issues were. The Vietnam War, students, of course, were subject to the draft, potentially, racial discrimination, especially in Harlem, lack of diversity in the curriculum, And students in these years spent many, many hours organizing small dorm meetings. These are some great hand-drawn flyers from that period. Come to SDS, 7th floor, 10 p.m. tonight. We'll talk about it. So they were tending to build energy around their causes, but for years and years, there was not all that much success at Columbia. But one main immediate cause of the 1968 protests focused on the university's plan to construct a gym in Morningside Park. I'm guessing that most people here are familiar with this, but here is the blueprint for the gym, and you can see that it would feature a separate entrance at the bottom level and a community gymnasium that would be blocked off from the university's facility. And students dubbed it Jim Crow. And it didn't help that the university had gotten basically a giveaway deal from Robert Moses, the Parks Commissioner, to put this facility inside public park at almost no cost, while also owning a vast amount of local real estate. So this was an extremely unpopular project, and for years opposition to it had been building up. Finally, in mid-April 1968, students protested at the gym site, tearing down the fences around the construction site, shutting down construction. And then from there, they went to Hamilton Hall, and the students occupied Hamilton Hall as a body. And after several hours of conversation, Black members of the Society of Afro-American Students asked white students to leave Hamilton Hall and occupy their own buildings. So by the end of that day and into the next day, students occupied 5 buildings on campus, which they would hold for the next week. So here are some pictures from inside the occupied buildings, people sleeping on the floor. There's a sign that says, "Liberated Women, Remember Your Pill," up there in Fairweather Hall. And so hundreds of students were in these buildings for the last week of April 1968. And this uprising, at an Ivy League university in the media capital of the country, became one of the largest news events of a year that would see more than its fair share of banner headlines. And everyone who was involved in this had an experience that would change their lives. And among the people who participated was Eleanor Raskin, who, AKA my mother, who was a Columbia Law student in 1968. Eleanor began that week as a legal observer, trying to give legal support to students, but by the end had fully committed herself to the protests. One thing that has for way too long been appreciated about this moment, which is sort of often told as the story of SDS and Mark Rudd, is the crucial role of SAS and the Black students in Hamilton Hall. And in fact, it was the idea to have an all-Black building on campus, which really set off the administrators' fears and guilt about their relationship to the community of Harlem. And the threat of actually having Black people from Harlem intervening on campus in this protest is what made the administration hold off for so long to take action against the students. So they really brilliantly leveraged the fear and the guilt that existed in the minds of President Grayson Kirk and others of the latent power and anger of a neighboring community. Just as a quick aside, looking at this photo, I think I can reveal now that it was my mother, Eleanor, who spray painted those words, "No Gym," on the wall of Hamilton Hall. I think the statute of limitations has run on that. So as the week progressed, police presence near campus increased, and a sense of foreboding anticipations of violence grow. Having negotiated a peaceful withdrawal with the Black students in Hamilton, Columbia administrators unleashed the New York Police Department on its own students. And in an action known as the police bust, on the night of April 30th, 1968, 700 students were arrested, often quite needlessly, brutally, and violently. And this was, at the time, the largest mass arrest in the history of the New York Police Department. Since then, it was surpassed by some of the arrests during the Occupy Wall Street movement, but this remains one of the largest police actions in the history of the city. In the university's official report on the protests of 1968, known as the Cox Commission, that panel summarized its findings this way. The violence and ensuing injuries have had such disastrous effects upon Columbia in intensifying divisions, mutual distrust, and self-supporting cycles of fantasy within isolated factions that one is tempted to conclude that some other course simply had to be found. And while hundreds of students participated in the occupation, their action, especially the tactic of shutting down the university, had never really enjoyed support from a majority of the student community. Many students, a majority of the students certainly were sympathetic to their issues, but it wasn't until the administration called in the police and the police behaved with such brutality against the students that the overwhelming majority of campus sympathy sided with the protesters. At that point, the administration had effectively lost its legitimacy on campus. And as a direct result of these protests, Columbia's president resigned. The university permanently canceled its plans to construct a gym in Morningside Park. The ROTC program on campus was discontinued. The university senate was created in the hopes of creating a true form of shared campus governance. And around the country, students in other universities occupied their own buildings. And by the end of that year, there had been hundreds and hundreds of occupations, and universities all around the country had been shut down. In the 30s, Columbia administrators had collaborated with the FBI to investigate their own students. And in the aftermath of 1968, college leadership once again spent enormous energy and resources pursuing this question of punishment. These are photos that I find pretty chilling, which I discovered in the archives. And these show photos of the protesters with identification tags that administrators had written to identify student names in the hopes of using this as evidence in disciplinary hearings. And although the administration did hold numerous disciplinary hearings and attempted to pursue punishments and expulsions for years, eventually, my understanding is that the vast majority of penalties were dropped and the campus moved on to something like a return to normalcy instead of pursuing revenge in the aftermath of these protests. But there were real consequences for Columbia. I think the endowment suffered, university prestige suffered. Here's an article from 1969, Spring Protests Affect Applications. According to this article, enrollment declined among sons of alumni and from people living in relatively conservative areas. So Columbia's reputation had changed. Formerly, it would be a bastion for people from those areas, but now, in the aftermath of 1968, Columbia had been identified with radicalism. And this identification would never go away. So a decade after the 1968 protests, we can really begin to trace the potency forming around this radical tradition. By the mid-1970s, political attention had started to focus on South African apartheid. And at Columbia, all sides, students, administrators, were armed with a set of tactics and responses that they had learned from previous crises. So here's an article from 1978 that perfectly shows what I'm talking about. In 1978, Mark Rudd came back to campus a decade after 1968. Rudd had been one of the main leaders of the 1968 protests. And after participating in a panel discussion on South Africa, he led a demonstration of several hundred students in a march to the president's office, to the president's house, in fact. So here we can see that students from past generations are returning to campus. They're bringing new energies. They're talking about new issues. And current students have access to them and their experiences. And then, right in that same period, here's a secret memo written by President McGill that same year, who says, he describes the university as an ethical institution confronting an ethical problem, which is a very specific way to talk about the university's endowments and its investments. And he says, most tellingly, we do not intend this time to abandon this high moral ground to the campus Marxists, as we have done too often in the past. So here in 1978, we see a perfect example of the radical tradition at work. On the one hand, participants in previous movements are on hand to work with current students engaging with new issues. On the other, the administration is considering an ethical response, not just from decency, but in fear of the consequences of student pressures and protests. It would take nearly another decade for Columbia to actually divest from South Africa. And in the meantime, Columbia students, for the second time in 20 years, launched another national mass movement, this time around the demand for divestment. As with 1968, the leaders of the divestment movement had spent years organizing and attempting to build consensus before taking more aggressive and confrontational actions. In the spring of 1985, students barricaded Hamilton Hall for 3 weeks, maintaining an encampment outside of the building. So they're harkening back to Hamilton Hall as the key site of 1968. They chose not to occupy it, but instead to barricade it and block access to it. They also participated in hunger strikes to demonstrate the seriousness of the issue. And inspired by Columbia students, these forms of blockades proliferated. By the end of April 1985, students had taken over more than 100 campuses with sit-ins and blockades to protest apartheid in South Africa. In another tactic that used campus spaces, Columbia students erected shanties on Low Plaza to symbolize the struggles and resistance of Black South African communities. And although these students faced disciplinary procedures and constant threats and even physical violence from conservative students, the administration in the 1980s did not resort to mass arrests. I believe a few students were arrested, but there was nothing like what we had seen in 1968, where thousands of police came to clear the campus. And as you can see from this headline, officials say shanties okay. The administration even gave some approval to the creation of these structures, and eventually the shanties were voluntarily removed by the student activists themselves. So here we have a sense that lessons have been learned on both sides. There is an avoidance of the type of tactics that would lead to major escalations, and the university administration is not going to call the police on its own students. This toleration was not appreciated by everybody. Here is op-ed written by Neil Gorsuch from that year, complaining about how the administration is being too lenient with the protesters. But in fact, the vast majority of people this time supported the student movement, opposed the apartheid regime in South Africa, and the Columbia student protest was quite popular. And I came across this memo from President Sovereign's office, and you can see here a list of all of the phone calls that came in during one day in the middle of those protests in 1985. On one side, there's a list of 22 people who are for students, and then one lonely alumnus who's in support of Sovereign. So due to this public feeling and the fact that students had succeeded in pressuring the university and winning support, in October 1985, the Columbia trustees, in fact, did vote for divestment of university's $41 million worth of South Africa-related stock, making Columbia the first major private university in the country, and perhaps in the world, to announce full divestment from South Africa. And really, this moment, which is one of Columbia's proudest, was the result of student protests undertaken in the face of serious risk and threats. So in the decades after 1985, students have participated in a steady stream of protests. Nothing until recently was at the same scale necessarily, but everyone was now drawing on a familiar set of tactics and strategies from this growing radical tradition. There were a series of occupations of Hamilton, of Lowe. There were frequent and sometimes successful calls for divestment, including divestment from private prison companies, divestment from fossil fuel companies. And everyone now is familiar with this idea of using campus spaces to make their claims, contest their tactics, and vie for community support. In 1996, students occupied Lowe Library to demand the creation of an ethnic studies program. And in this case, police were called in and 22 students were arrested. So there's not a linear progress here, but a series of individual events. And I think one of the future discussions in this series will talk about these protests and the creation of the Ethnic Studies Center. So up to this point, most of these events have been before my time, but the first major protest that I remember seeing firsthand at Columbia came in 2007 when I just started as a history student in the PhD department. And overnight, seemingly, students had erected a series of tents in front of Butler Library, and protesters had launched a hunger strike, which they would maintain for the next several days, maybe as many as a couple of weeks for some of them, to demand continued expansion of ethnic studies and a variety of other curriculum-related issues, including curriculum issues related to the core. And as in the past, these students were using a playbook of tactics. They had an encampment on the main lawn. The hunger strike had been called before. Campus reaction here was somewhat mixed. I remember this when people calling themselves college Republicans ate donuts in front of the hunger strikers. And although many people supported the protest demands, others felt that their cause did not merit such an extreme tactic as a hunger strike. But in fact, these students had been working for years to try to build momentum around these issues and had not gotten a lot of attention. And then suddenly their hunger strike put them on the front page of every newspaper in the country. So the question of whether this succeeded or not plays out in real time, and you can't tell in advance how it will end. But clearly by the 21st century, Columbia's radical tradition had a pattern in place. It had a set of seemingly predictable processes. There was an interplay of contentious politics, a constant back and forth between tactics, issues, support, blowback, sympathy. And what we see here is not an unbroken trajectory, but really a set of lessons and tactics that were learned, then were unlearned, tested in new moments with slightly different results. And so, in the middle of April in 2024, I was walking to work on the morning that the first encampment was created last year. And I think it was created to coincide with then President Shafiq's congressional testimony. And, I paused with a colleague to watch the students, and the colleague said, I don't know what they're doing. This is a waste. They'll never accomplish anything. But thinking about this radical tradition, it was clear to me that you really can never overestimate how much power Columbia students can wield here in New York City, here at this Ivy League institution. And in fact, in the last 60 years or so, Columbia students have created 3 separate mass movements that have spread all over the country and all over the world, taking enormous personal risks each time. And this is a record that is really unmatched by any other comparable institution. So Columbia's radical tradition, love it or hate it, is certainly one of the most significant outcomes of the 20th century's history on campus. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jones. That was fascinating, and I had, for myself, I had no idea how pivotal 68 was in terms of a student consensus that was conservative, retrograde, obviously racist and problematic in terms of the long view of history, versus what happened in 68 and how that got adopted into the culture of Columbia. At first, it was a deficit and in terms of fundraising and other applications and so on, but it's something that our university embraced and is now, a critical part of student life. One question that I have, and I should remind people, I should let people know, if you want to pose a question, if you already haven't done so, put it into the Q&A, and we will try and go through it and try and find ones that are representative of the broader set that gets delivered. But while you're doing that, while some of the participants are doing that, I wanted to ask you, Professor Jones. The protest that came about after Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th last year, was there a similar student movement as in past events, like in the 60s and in the 1980s for South Africa? Was there a similar history of student protest or lobbying the university to divest in the same way that Columbia CUAD, which is the divestment, the group that wants Columbia to divest from Israel? Was there a similar movement to do that, or did the radical protest tradition simply break through immediately because of the attack?
Yeah. Well, certainly the protest tradition is very much alive in this most recent protest movement. Certainly there have been people who have been organizing around questions related to justice in Palestine for decades. Columbia has always been a center for a lot of those conversations. Professors teaching Middle Eastern history here have had these debates in their classrooms for 20 years, at least, often in really complex and heated ways. In the beginning of last year, by the middle of October, by December, there were students who were trying to get this story into people's minds. I remember at the tree lighting, which would have been, I guess, early December, there was a group of students with signs saying, "Joy is canceled." And, I remember feeling that they seemed like a very courageous and rather small group of people. And it really wasn't until the administrators banned the two student organizations, SJP and JVP, that students focused on this attention, which again seemed at least as much about campus governance questions as it was about global conflicts, began to spread. And the fact that students very quickly coalesced around this question of divestment, although there have been longstanding movements about divestment related to Israel, students clearly were looking back at Columbia's history, specifically the anti-apartheid movement, and seeing that Columbia actually occupied this amazing space as the first American private institution to divest from South Africa. It was one of the proudest moments in the institution's political history, and they, with extreme savvy, they identified divestment as a way to speak to that tradition. And these are Columbia students. They did it in full knowledge of this history, and really, found a way to connect their movement to this history that we've been talking about today. So it was very much, it was not like it came out of nowhere, but when it became global news, students were ready with their knowledge of what had come before them on campus.
So I think what's really interesting about that is that the history of student action and effectiveness actually is, and when that was resisted by the university with banning two groups, that catalyzed a much broader group of the student population to be in support of what had been before that a relatively small movement on campus. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then, support just grew and grew. I mean, obviously not everybody supported it, but there was polls in the end of the spring saying that more than 70%, 75% of the student body was in support of the protests. And a lot of that support was about the crackdown on student rights and free speech,
Yeah.
as much as it was directly about student arguments related to Gaza. I mean, that was obviously a huge part too, and you can't separate those two things. So one thing to be aware of is that there's not necessarily a response that the administration could have had that would have solved things. Often these politics are taking place far beyond the scale of the university, and the local reaction is part of it, but not. There's not a full response possible, and that happened in the '60s also. Nothing that Columbia administrators could do was going to effectively resolve issues relating to Vietnam.
So I was a university senator for the alumni in 2013 to 2018, and during that period of time, the Senate approved the divestment from private prisons at that time, and worked through the committee that's been set up, the Joint Committee on socially responsible investing, set up to help with the endowment. That doesn't seem to have happened, or at least I'm not aware of that really having had an opportunity to happen with this particular protest movement and with this call for divestment. Your sense of it, having been around, why? Is it because things erupted too quickly, or was it? What's your maybe the second question is, what's your sense of how the Senate has been effective or not been effective at different points in this protest history in allowing for organizational institutional change?
Well, I mean, one of the major moments of crisis last year involved like the key rule. I mean, Kurt, you probably know this better than me, but my understanding is that after 1968, basically the first rule, the cornerstone rule that the Senate was set to enforce, was a rule against presidents and administrations calling police onto campus without Senate approval. Do you know what I'm talking about? Does that ring true to you?
It is. It's there's supposed to be consultation, and in this particular round, the Senate feels very aggrieved at how short the consultation was, or that it wasn't done it wasn't done as intended. Certainly not as they understood it to be intended.
Yeah. So I think a lot of the outrage that we saw in the spring, and which potentially we'll see more of, had to do with the sense that the administration was, not playing by its own rules, was violating this central commandment of university governance that had been established as one of the major legacies of the institution's most significant traumatic event, the police arriving in 1968. And yet they were claiming through a set of these new rules that they were changing constantly to be supporting rules, and they were describing the rule of law and the importance of university rules as if that provided some ethical cover for a crackdown on protest and free speech. And yet at the same time, they were ignoring what you would consider the sort of most important single rule of campus governance. So, the Senate has an advisory role. In the South Africa protests, the Senate voted for divestment years before the trustees did, and part of how that protest spread was the realization that the Senate actually did not have authority over endowment and the finances. So, the Senate has been at the center of all these movements, but often it's there because its supposed power has been ignored by the administration. So this idea of sort of how rules are being enforced has been a major way that student mobilization has spread.
There are a lot of questions from alumni across the generations, actually, as to how this 24, not 1924, but 2024, is different than a lot of the protests since 1968, with the level of violence and property damage, and also and mass arrests and harm coming to students. What do you see differently? It's a little bit on the same topic. What do you see as being different about this protest that led to very different outcome since the outcome of 1968?
Well, there's been a lot of conversations about how it's similar, how it's different. I mean, clearly, the first thing we can say is that in terms of protest movements on campus, there's now a big three. It's really 1968, 1985 in South Africa, and what just happened last year. And having been around campus for the last 20 years or so now, every year something's going on, and there have been a lot of really important conversations that we've had. But there had not been something like this really since 1968. So, the scale of it meant that the only way to think about it is in conjunction with what happened in the 60s, I believe. And, I mean, every one of these movements is a little bit different as they have different contexts. But to my mind, the sort of the role of the media is really interesting. I mean, if you were on campus and you saw hundreds of TV cameras here every day, and then kind of saw how news coverage was really not reflecting what was really happening on campus, that was there in '68 as well. One thing that we had now was the doxing trucks on Columbia's own students. I mean, the way that the students themselves had to face really serious threats from people who were not related to, not on campus or affiliated with campus. That was new, and that was really scary. So in my feeling, the two movements are very comparable, different moments, different technologies, but in both cases, students were really taking enormous risks and were, acting in favor for ethical questions that decades from now, people are going to see and celebrate their courage.
Mm-hmm. So we have some questions, a lot of questions, but one that I'm going to call out to Bernice Tsai, a question that she put to Professor Jackson last night, and she put it to you as well. What is the opportunity to use the issues that inspire protests as an opportunity for dialogue and critical inquiry that can unite the community through academic purpose? How do we evolve, so to speak, through the protest movement?
Well, I believe that that we should all, everyone on campus should agree on the first place to come together in defense of free speech, right to protest, and the sort of equal institution of laws and penalties. I think that a lot of the ways that dialogue has broken down beyond just the fundamental disagreements about what's happening in Israel and Gaza has to do with the sense that the administration rules are not being administered fairly. And I think that since the diminishment of free speech for everybody affects everybody, I think the first step is a sort of collective act of resistance saying that we as a community will defend the right to protest for everybody and demand equal and fair imposition of rules. So we have lost that kind of baseline where there's a sense that there are rules in play that are the same for everybody. And until we get back to there, I don't think we can have a productive conversation that has to do with the issues. So that's what I think we'll hopefully that we'll see. I mean, right now, for people who are not on campus, campus remains highly secured, only accessible by ID cards. There have been major physical landscape changes put in place, and I think people have to resist the temptation that I'm sure is out there to keep those permanently, and we need to sort of step back to a place where we can have a more open civil conversation or open civil disobedience. But right now we're not back at that level playing field.
Okay. Here's a question that really goes to that's addressed to you as a scholar of the history of protest, from Sophia Rivera, who's class of 24, just graduated. She was there during the term. In terms of archival preservation and categorization, how can we as students who lived through or are living through the student movement contribute to archives at Columbia and elsewhere?
Well, thank you, Sophia, who is a former student of mine, for that question. Well, I mean, if you look at the archives for 1968 and 1985, one thing that you see is that students at the time were really just too enraged at Columbia to participate in the sort of archiving process at the time. So, a lot of the collections that are here from 1968 actually came here decades later as people who collect things from the time eventually downsized or cleaned out a garage and made peace with Columbia. And in terms of 1985, having done a partial examination of those records, I'm not sure that there's really any student voices in that archive. I think that the students who were here just left with such a sense of enmity toward the university that they did not feel like they wanted to participate in that process. So for today's archives, it's going to be a long process. I think we took some steps to collect some materials. There was some pushback actually that the archive was moving sort of too quickly to try to do that. But I think from my teaching experience, the power of those archives of past student action to really inform how current students think about their politics is really clear. And so if you think about future Columbia students as one of the constituencies for these materials, I do hope that eventually there will be an archive here related to what has just happened, and that, I know that future students are going to use those materials to think about their relationship to the university.
Thank you, Professor. The protests have led, at least in two cases, maybe in three, depending on how you want to count the history, to the end of the term of a president at Columbia. Can you reflect on really what on the dynamic there a little bit more, and really what's called for? We have an interim president right now. What sort of president do we need at this should we be looking for in the future, and with reflections on the consequences of the presidency in the past?
I mean, certainly the presidents, certainly in '68 and just recently, became the face of opposition. I think most students know, even if they don't have exactly a sense of how the university governance is structured, that the president doesn't necessarily have, all the power in these conversations. So the question of the president's power is something that has been debated. I think I found a quote from President Bollinger, of all people, in 2008, saying that the use of police had been a major violation of campus ethics. But it's sort of easy to say that when you're not faced with a student uprising. At the end of the day, I think a president can be a little bit more or a little bit less conducive toward lowering the temperature on campus. If there's a sense among the community that the president stands for something and is honestly engaging with their own kind of beliefs and practices, I think that is considered to be good. But at the end of the day, often these movements really just go beyond campus governance, and there's nothing really at the institutional level that is going to solve these problems. So I think what we should call for is, a shared campus governance with, real equity among faculty, Senate and administration and students, and the sort of fair and equal playing out of those rules. And so that's really what we did not see this past year. And so I think that's what we need from a president, is someone who will share governance and enforce the rules equally.
That does seem to be a major difference in how things did play out in the 80s and the 90s and the early aughts in terms of student demands and how they were, they were worked through the Senate and worked through probably other lines of communication, and that doesn't seem to have happened this time. We're getting really right near the end of the hour, and we are determined to keep it to just an hour. So I want to thank you, first of all, Professor Jones, on your scholarship and your presentation of a surprisingly long history, for and against the forward movement of history, and as well all the fantastic questions that individuals have posed. I wish I could have gotten to all of them, but I couldn't. I want to take a moment to advertise the next two conversations that we will have in this series later in the fall, and be on the lookout for reminders and register for them and put your questions in ahead of time. I'm saying that to all of the participants, and thank you for your participation and your questions. The next one is on October 16th. And that will be that will be by Professor Nye, from the Center on for Ethnic Studies and Racial and Ethnic Studies. It'll be on October 16th, again at 12 o'clock, and her title is Ethnic Studies and the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, or CSER as it's usually called here. And then the next one after that is October 30th, the very end of the month, again at 12 o'clock. And it will be Professor Robert Neer, who's also in the Department of History. All three of them are. And it will be Civil Disobedience, Intellectual Foundations of Civil Disobedience. And I believe he's going to be picking a text. It may well be Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. And there will be breakout groups there where there will be small group discussion that we'll do, and we're still figuring out exactly how that format will work. So again, thank you everybody for participating. Thank you, Professor Jones, for speaking to us and answering all of some of our questions. And we look forward to convening the next talk on the 16th at noon again. Thank you.